yeah, Yoshi's Woolly World. I
Yeah,
think.
I
Yeah,
love those Paper Mario games. Like, I love the art style on those. Those are so much fun.
there's a lot to lean into the aesthetic of physical things in the digital. It's rather interesting.
I liked the origami one for Switch, but
Ooh, yeah, yeah.
it was a little. It wasn't as deep as Thousand Year Door, which I think is the
The high
baseline for
watermark.
me. Yeah, for sure. Also, the combat was really weird. It's like concentric circles.
Mm. Let's see. Also, I just saw something from a minute ago. Uh, yeah, it's really odd, but then he goes flippy wild for the lightsaber fight, and I'm like, the goblin's back, baby. So thank you for that, Christian Sorrell, adding a lot to this conversation.
Yeah, I mean, he saves it all for flips.
Yeah, the
I wish
original.
Yoda was in like a Professor X like chair, like using his mind to like float around instead of like trying to
He
walk
did
all
that
the
in
time.
the prequels. He did
Well,
that in the
that's
prequels.
why he gets Luke to carry him around. Luke
Yeah,
is his
right.
Professor X chair.
I'd also like to say that I think the talk is starting now.
Oh,
Well, then we're talking about goblins in literature and film.
Nick, you
Okay.
set this up. You want to take the lead?
I
Me?
think Sean's ready to go.
Sean, let's go.
All right, let's do it. Welcome, everybody, to Empty Rooms Horror in Architecture. This is our talk about horror and terror and how that interacts with space in your games as designers, but also just as referees or players and that kind of thing. All of us are up here because we've interacted with this in our own designs in some way. So we're going to be going through and talking about sort of how we've approached the use of space in architecture in our horror games. Um, and then, just going back and forth and riffing with each other for a little bit, and then we're going to open it up to the floor for Q&A. If you see at the bottom, you have a little raise hand button that you can click if you want to ask a question, and then we can call on you. We'll do our best to sort of see your names when they're all covered up. I'm not exactly sure how to do that.
You unmute.
Yeah, no, yeah, Sean, you gotta.
Oh, sorry. If you double click on a person, I'm trying to see your names. You'll go walk over to them immediately. So, just like walking off the stage and talking to someone. Okay, why don't we go around and introduce ourselves real quick, and then I'll dive in, talk a little bit more about the topic, and we'll get started.
For
Goblin
sure.
Archives, we want to start with you. I don't know if we all have the same left to right. I see Goblin, Stella, Logan, and then that's all of us. Yeah.
I like that. Let's do it.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm Goblin Archives. I wrote a game called Liminal Horror, and have put out a couple things for Exalted Funeral Summer Sale, the mall and the bureau, and this is a topic that comes into play a lot in my own designs. Off to Stella in the corpse paint.
Hello, I'm Stella. I write a series of pamphlets for Mothership called Rimbound Transmission, with a focus on having horror that is applicable anywhere.
Nice.
Dean.
I am Logan Dean. I wrote a game called The Company, and a module called Extraction from Demon Fucked Cleveland in 1996. And I write about corporate horror, which heavily influenced by Resident Evil and things like Chernobyl. So industrial, grimy, working economic terror. What a time!
We were just talking about your extraction from Demon Cleveland in the Mothership server yesterday, and I was like, "Oh my god, I have to check that out." I had no idea that was you, so that's awesome.
Oh, thanks.
I'm Sean McCoy. I designed Mothership and Two Rooms to Boom with Alan Girding at Tuesday Night Games. Super into horror and sci-fi, and architecture's topic really near and dear to my heart as well. Also, Riley Q just let us know that if you go down to the podium on the right side of the stage and you stand on that little megaphone thing, you can ask a question vocally to the whole room so everybody can hear you. We'll be able to capture you on the video, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, when we were bashing together this idea in Discord before the con and sort of working through what we would want to do and what we'd want to talk about, we all had all these designers and writers, and we all had a big interest in graphic design and horror and that sort of stuff. This came together, and the whole title, Empty Rooms, is basically based on the idea that in Dungeons and Dragons, starting with Moldvay, you've got this like stalking procedure of what you might find in a room, in a dungeon, right? And it's treasure, tricks, traps, monsters, but also empty rooms, which I think for a lot of people when you're getting started in game design or being a dungeon master, that empty rooms space is kind of like the kind of role, because it just means nothing to most people. And we're sort of here to talk about how actually that empty space role reveals a ton about the world of Dungeons and Dragons very, very succinctly by just saying most of the world that you're inhabiting, most of the world you're exploring is abandoned. It's empty by default. Something was here and now it's not. And the more you sort of deconstruct that idea, the more important it becomes, and the more it sort of reveals to you about the ruined nature of these places. And you might take that for granted in Dungeons and Dragons, like, of course, we're in a dungeon, of course, a lot of this is going to be abandoned. But if you drive into that sort of feeling and that vibe of ruin and abandon and what's left behind, you'll actually find that in your empty rooms in your games, you can sort of create this sense of anticipation and ease, right? And the core sort of gameplay loop of a treasure-based dungeon crawl, you're, going up to the slot machine and you're hitting, monster, trick, trap, something bad, empty, something neutral, or a treasure, something good, right? And you go keep pulling that lever on every single room. But that empty room is just very integral for building anticipation, building tension, right? Controlling the pace of your delve. And so for me, that's like my first interaction with this idea of how a space controls and influences your game, both narratively by what's in the space, but also just by its very sort of presence and compared to the other spaces. Does that resonate with any of you on the panel? Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah, absolutely.
For sure.
I love playing with space, especially in D&D, just because like you get an opportunity to tell story and exposition, which in Dungeons and Dragons is mostly told through hitting stuff. So anytime you get some downtime to tell, like, hey, maybe there's some bones here, and then like, or you can get into like artwork or like a culture, and start to like really seed the idea of what you can use it for foreshadowing, you can use it for backstory, you can use it for anything. Like that's a gift that the game has given you, instead of just, oh, here's some goblins, beat them up.
No, I absolutely agree. And you could sort of take any of the spaces and say what happened here and what is left behind. And that's the sort of thing that players have to sort of hang their hat on, right? And if you start doing that with every empty room, you start to realize how powerful that tool is in sort of shaping the experience for your players. And additionally, how you can start to blur the line between what is empty and what's not empty. And like the mimic is the great sort of intro into that, where you think a room's empty, you think it has treasure, and all of a sudden, no, it has a monster, right? And so when your players start to not be able to tell between what's an empty room, what's a trick room, what's a trap room, what's a special room, right? And what's a room with a monster or treasure, all of a sudden you get all this interactivity as they sort of work to discover what the actual true purpose of this room is. And I think sort of part of the enduring success of that game is it gives you this very basic blueprint for how to architecturally design this space, right? By giving you these 5 or 6 categories. And then on just the easiest mode where you're like, this room is empty. It's stone walls and tiles, and there's nothing in here. It's 30 by 20 foot. There's doors to the north and west. The game still works. Like at that very basic fundamental where there's nothing in here. It's just a hole in the floor and it's dark. Your torch is burned down a little bit further. You got to keep going. I'm sure all of you have played that first game or that game where you're a kid, where even that amount of description is enough to kind of set you on edge and get you thinking about like, okay, we're moving through this quiet, dark, empty space, like, all right, we're sort of opening a door in that kind of Resident Evil 1 way where you're pushing it open, you don't know what's going to happen in the next room. But then as you level up and you gain more experience as a DM, you start having these, old libraries or these old abandoned laboratories or these larders or whatever, and you start realizing that empty rooms could have had a purpose at once. And then, the ultimate God mode is you're going in there going like, I have no idea. I see a bed, I see curtains, I see a statue, it's been knocked over. We're trying to piece together what's going on. Oh, you hear a click on a panel. This room wasn't empty. This was a trap all along. And all of that serves to heighten the tension of like, should we delve deeper? So sort of that concept. I think Logan said it in chat, like Dungeons and Dragons has architecture in the title. Like half of that title is dungeons, right? It's an exploration of space. So not to belabor that point too much, but that's why we're here. That's what we're interested in. So I think we're just going to go around the table and talk about how we've approached horror and sort of architecture in our games. I think, guys, feel free, both on the panel and in the audience, to raise your hand if you want to jump in and ask a question or anything like that to clarify what we're saying, or sort of at the end of the chat, we're running for about an hour, right? In about 20 minutes, we'll start opening up, 20, 30 minutes. We'll just open the floor up to questions and we'll do a more true Q&A. But this way we can sort of pass the mic back and forth to each other. Goblin, do you want to take it away?
Yeah, so I just put out, it was funny, and I think that it helped when we're talking about what to make for this panel, right? I just wrote the mall and then co-wrote with Josh Domansky the bureau, which both really are reliant on their settings, not only for sort of the building of tension, but to like anchor players into a space. A lot of thought went into like with the mall, like most of us have a schema for what malls are and how they make us feel. And so using that as that starting point to try to get people not necessarily into a comfort level, because there's an inherent uncomfortability around spaces like that. I don't know myself. It's for malls. It's not like a place I go to relax. It's a place where it fills a function. And so using the module to sort of get characters and players into a headspace that then you can start to throw in the weird, and that contrast for them like knocks them out of what was sort of like their frame of reference. And I think that's really helpful. And using that idea of an empty space, like going into an empty shop, can tell you what the space was about, and then how it's changed can inform the players of what's happened there, right? If I start with a normal mall and then you go into the sports store and everything's upturned, that lets the players sort of like understand how this space has changed. And then also thinking around moments where there is high action and high tension, and then there's a moment of reprieve where there isn't something going on, is also unsettling. It gives a moment to sort of like bring the tension down, but then realizing why is this space calm, and it sort of throws into contrast the other parts of what you're playing. So for me, when I'm writing liminal horror adventures, right, or modules or whatever you want to call them, I like to start with this like settings that are relatable. I think that takes a lot of load off of the facilitator in terms of like description, because it instantly keys in for people if I describe like if I had to describe a security office with the linoleum floor and the flickering fluorescence, like we can all sort of like transport there really quickly because it's spaces we engage with regularly. And then that's when you can start to seep in the weird, and it makes the weird even weirder because it's easily imaginable.
Yeah, you have that sort of baseline establishment, right? Which just helps like give the players a preconceived notion. I think playing with expectation and anticipation is huge in that. sort of way, right? You have this mall, so players instantly have sort of some sort of expectation, and that gives you, as the facilitator and the designer, something to play with immediately, right off the bat, right?
Yeah, and so like you can easily evoke things quickly. Not to say you can't in fantasy, but it requires a different set of tools because we don't have the day-to-day associations oftentimes. I've had players before that described when we ran fantasy around a difficulty imagining certain things. And so me as the GM would have to like really elicit that to help build that understanding together. Whereas when we do spaces like malls, office buildings, which is the bureau, I can pretty easily mine for things that I know my players have experienced themselves. And it takes that load off and lets me then build tension in the other ways and playing and pushing on that. Like we all know the waiting chairs that are uncomfortable, and so like how can I take that and then push it farther?
Yeah, I've found that in I think horror games are a great introduction to new players who've never played role playing games before, because usually whether that's the company or the bureau or mothership or Call of Cthulhu or whatever, you're saying right up front like just be you and react to the space and the situation around you. And there's usually like I think Call of Cthulhu and Delta Green and all these games do better in sort of more modern settings. Even Mothership's like far in the future, but we usually say like it's just the 80s, right? But you're in space. We want to take all that cognitive load off of you about um, imagining like what are the rules of this place. We want you to immediately be able to rely on your instinct, right? In a horror game. And so instinctually knowing like if we're in a mall, if we're in an office building, we can go here, we can find a payphone, or we can call the cops. Is there a locker room? Is there a basement? There's this or that. So your instincts are sort of rewarded by being able to imagine a space that's very sort of real around you. Um, so I think that's great, and it's just a great way for new players to get in because they don't have that cognitive load. Like, what's magic? How does a feudal society work?
I think for new players and new designers, right? Like if you're
Yeah,
writing your own adventure, like it lets you as the writer get to use those assumptions as well. When I was planning for the mall, I just sat and thought, what's in a mall? I walked through a mall. I would walk through the Lloyd Center over here in Portland that's slowly closing down and dying. I was like, okay, what's here? What rooms should I key? And I
how
was
did
able,
that inform your design? I'm in a city full of tons of dead malls, right? And so I can really see getting a lot out of that experience.
yeah. So I really enjoyed being able to walk through the place. I used the actual map. I redrew the map for the mall from my mall, and I think it allowed me to see how different spaces functioned in reality. Right? I can tell how close and how far things are, how big the scale is. And since it was a dying mall, and I wrote about a dying mall, how empty parts of it were because you have a lot of spaces that are closed down, which then helped me pepper around where I keyed spaces. Also, I took that um, gradient descent was also a really big inspiration for like how you do a multi-level mega dungeon, and that was especially what we used for the bureau. But then thinking about how movement should relate to each other, um, and having run those, like how the tension should move between spaces.
Yeah, I think that's great. There's something very particularly just tragic about sort of a dying mall in a lot of ways. It really speaks to like nostalgia or like a bygone era, right? Like if you grew up sort of in our age group or whatever, if you're a millennial or older. So I think there's a lot you can like instantly tap into about people's feelings about some of these abandoned spaces, right? Um, Stella, why don't we kick it over to you? You've done some awesome pamphlets and all this sort of design. How has this concept sort of affected your work?
Well, I think that for me, there's a lot of different facets of it. But whenever I think about an empty space, as someone who lives in San Francisco, a place that is dominated by hostile architecture, I think of things being intentionally empty. And that's kind of something that you see throughout these kind of spaces that you see touted online as liminal. Oftentimes they are spaces that are meant to have a lot of people in them, but they're not like full. And you know, most of the time you see people talk about stuff such as like malls being the creepiest, you know? There's supposed to be a lot of people in here, but there's not really much of anyone in here. And that's because when you break it down, if you actually go and try and like just be and exist at a mall for a short amount of time, you realize that no, this place isn't meant to have a lot of people. It's meant to tolerate a lot of people. You know, it is fundamentally a place that wants you out of there. And I think that once you start thinking about that, it starts having really interesting implications. For example, if you sorry, I lost my train of thought. I should turn my Discord to do not disturb.
You were talking about how like these spaces
Yeah.
were not meant to like hospitably house a lot of people. They were meant to tolerate a lot of people.
Yeah.
Now they don't, right?
Exactly. It's why whenever you see like compilations of like liminal images or whatever, where it's like leaning into like, oh, this place is deserted, I don't think I've ever seen like, oh, here's an empty baseball stadium, you know? And like, by all means, according just to the metric that it should just be a place meant to have a lot of people in it, that there aren't a lot of people in it. Those should be like prime things, because those are empty most days of the week. It gets night most days of the week, you know? So once you start realizing that no, it's actually these spaces that are hostile to humanity in very subtle ways, and start thinking, well, how do I apply that to ratchet up the tension? Now, admittedly, I'm scared of malls even when they're not empty, mainly because I'm an agoraphobic shut-in. I know I look like a model stand-up citizen that goes around the town, but no, I'm a little bit of a weirdo. And just being in those spaces is like, it makes me think, well, how do I do this? For example, if it's in a dungeon, like, do you want to stay in a room where you can see that the floor is intentionally divoted to leave like stagnant water in there? Like, by all means, there's nothing in there that's really like stopping you, but like you kind of automatically understand that like this place I just shouldn't be in, you know? Because you don't want to be around one, stagnant water, but also just the awkward angle of the floor itself makes it so you're not staying in there. So when you start taking that kind of stuff and applying it to dungeon design, what you end up doing is having a whole bunch of empty space that by all means feels like, oh yeah, you should be able to go there just fine. But when you're actually in the moment, you're like, no, I'm not staying there. Like, there are only very specific places I will go, and then there's this great empty unknown that is always changing. And that's why I think it can be really interesting in dungeon style designs where you keep hostile architecture in mind. It's not just that like, oh, this is a place bereft of purpose now that there are no longer people. This is a place where purpose has been achieved because there's no longer people. I think that is a very important distinction. I also think a great primer to understanding how I view liminal horror is the Connor O'Malley skit, Outlet Mall Special Ops. It is, for anyone familiar with Connor O'Malley, you will know that it is incredibly in-your-face, loud, profane, absurd, deeply American. And I think it is like the most important. Oh, there we go. There's links in the chat. I wish I should have brought like a little QR code or something that I can pull up. That would have been great. Anyways, it kind of paints a picture of the sort, like it makes you like assess who is the sort of person who enjoys being in these places, and the answer is a freak. Now, obviously, it is way more humorous than how I usually take it, but like, it just kind of permeates everything I think about. That this space doesn't want us there. It would be happier. It would just be happier if it killed us all, and all of the brands could just stay there in perfect harmony. And I think that's what guides me through this.
Oh no, go ahead.
But it's not just applicable to stuff like you know, dungeons or whatever. You can have stuff such as for example, an engine room in like a spaceship if we're doing something mothership inspired. obviously there's technically nothing wrong with being in there, but it's fundamentally not a space for human beings. So you avoid it as much as humanly possible. I think that is the way I look at empty rooms, whether it's empty by accident or on purpose, because that radically changes the way you understand the space.
I think that's great. And then thinking about like why are the players there? Either because they're in a space, either they're trapped there, or what's the function of them being in these spaces that are inhospitable to them. And that also creates like that extra layer of tension. It's always like we're camping in the dungeon always feels uncomfortable to me because I'm like, this is not a place for us to be resting. And I think, Sean, you did it really well in Mothership when talking about resting in dangerous spaces around like how do you truly fortify, or like not gaining health back, or whatever you want to play in that, of like, can you truly rest in these spaces in a room that is angled like this, or in a space that is inhospitable to people?
Yeah, Stella, you bring up a great point that like it's not that these rooms have not fulfilled their purpose, right? And it's like so sad that nobody is in this mall now. It's that they have fulfilled their purpose to sort of expunge people from them, and that was their sort of hidden purpose all along, was to be empty. And I think you also brought up this great point about um, when you're saying like who wants to be in these places, it's freaks. Like it's that the space is inhospitable to humans, but it is hospitable to something else inhuman, right? That this is actually where something else wants to be, the like whether that's something that's trapped there like a minotaur in a labyrinth, or some entity. If you've ever read, this is a minotaur again, but like House of Leaves is the great architecture horror sort of example of like what is this thing inhabiting this empty space that sort of this ritual of creating a building was designed for, right? When you speak to San Francisco and inhospitable architecture, I think of the like ultimate example of inhospitable architecture, which is the anti-homeless architecture, right? Like the benches with spikes on them, where it's like this thing has a purpose, right? Its purpose is to allow people like rest and respite, but you are denying that to a class of person for your political aims or whatever. And that's another form of inhospitable architecture, right?
Yeah. San Francisco is very dedicated to Screw it. It's too early in the morning. Pretend I said the word correct. It's too dedicated to that, to the point where we're not even satisfied with architecture. I remember a few years back, the SPCA, the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty Against Animals, bought a robot with the express goal to harass homeless people in their parking lot because they care a lot about the prevention of cruelty, So when I'm in like spaces, like it's always like, okay, I can't, when I'm waiting for a bus, it's not any respite. I'm on these weird rocking benches that are like curved like this, that like I can technically sit on, but it's just like,
Not for too long. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. It's just, well, no, not even the ones I can lean on. The like the person Squaddling says in chat, these are like at like butt sitting level, but like they're kind of curved like this, and they rotate a little bit on a
Oh my
central
god.
point. It's absurd, and like this kind of understanding that like everything is essentially telling me, go back in your room, be a shut-in, don't be here, is like something that permeates this place, and it really leans to this, especially if you start thinking about it critically and start applying it to what you're creating, makes this just like you can turn an empty room into a horror show where just like being trapped in there long enough with nothing happening is just like, I don't want to be here anymore, I don't want to be, you can turn anyone into a neurotic mess is what I'm saying, as a neurotic mess.
Wow.
Logan, and your design, the company, and some of your other stuff. How have you sort of approached this space interaction with horror, this empty rooms kind of sort of vibe?
So I'm kind of obsessed with urban planning and
Yeah, yeah.
on the flip side of these places that were meant to be kind of inhabited, fleetingly, I am interested in like the inherent terror of the failure of infrastructure and how we create these spaces for progress to be made, factories, offices, places for people to inhabit in which they are being productive. And what happens when that productivity is shut down? What happens when that infrastructure starts to fail? Like my biggest examples are the main inspiration for the company was the miniseries Chernobyl on HBO. How do we deal with these problems in real time? How do you deal with like a colony drop in Gundam, right? Like that's a terrifying prospect. So in my games, it's less exploring places that have been abandoned or where things are, where shadows are congealing. It's more these things are happening in real time, and you are you as players are directly responsible for either cleaning up a mess or preventing it. So you're going in with a scarcity of knowledge, usually a scarcity of supplies. I like to use scarcity a lot in my games, just to give you get like 2 out of 3. You got to choose stuff, knowledge, or people. Like you don't get it all, and that in itself creates a sense of terror because you don't have a specific tool to achieve your goal. But also, like, we all know what an office feels like. Even if you've never worked in an office, you know what it feels like. It's ubiquitous with media. We know what the office feels like from the television show. We know what a factory looks like. We know what a power plant looks like. And we also, from media, know what it looks like when those things fail. And it's terrifying because you have people working around the clock. Like if you've ever seen Apollo 13, you have these people working around the clock to make sure these people don't die in a tin can in space. That's just abject terror that's presented as drama. And I think shows like Severance do this really well, where they create a scale with architecture. I love brutalist architecture. I love Bertrand Goldberg. I love these large monoliths to the idea of construction, but they are terrifying. Like they're these big concrete tombs that people go to every day to work in. The Shining does it really well, with the way, especially the empty rooms concept of, because like there's empty rooms in The Shining that are terrifying that they actually like specifically call out to not go into. That hotel lives in my brain because I think about it all the time. Like the layout of the hotel, the carpet, the design of the rooms, just the windows, the maze. I think it's the most terrifying building in horror. The Overlook Hotel. It's it because you don't explore it completely. There's parts of it that are left off. There's mysteries that aren't solved. When you start bleeding into the past and the ghosts start terrorizing the family, you see all these little stories off to the side. And in larger buildings, larger architecture, there's always space for emotion to hide. There's places for things to get trapped. And so, I grew up in like an 1830s lumber baron manor in Bay City, Michigan. That the third floor in the early 20th century was a ballroom that burned down, and like 8 people died up there. So,
oh wow,
I like weird buildings and I like being inside of them. And so, like, I worked at the Art Institute of Chicago for 11 years, and I would be in there really late at night, and they turn all the lights off, and you can hear the steps of dogs at night in the Artists Institute of Chicago, because in the mid 20th century they would patrol the floors with guard dogs. And so, when at night you can still hear those dogs like walking around, and people have these stories of hearing these dogs walking around. And it's interesting because I think hauntings, especially in historic buildings, are just like echoes of these emotions that people who worked there for a long time like left behind. And I try to explore that type of stuff in my work in a contemporary sense. Like Eurydice, the adventure in the company, was originally written for Mothership. It's an underwater adventure I wrote for Mothership in 2019. And it's about small horror, confined spaces, claustrophobia, being in an underwater lab. But you can get that same type of abject terror from large open spaces because they're empty. And you think of them as being full, like the malls, or like a downtown area that's empty. like thinking about seeing the beginning of Day of the Dead when they're coming in on the helicopter and it's just this empty Miami area. Like that's like first thing in the morning, bright light. That's terrifying. Like you think of that place as being full of life, full of people, and seeing those spaces turned on their head, seeing those places that you think should be one thing and then another. That's in my opinion, that's the easiest way to evoke that sense of abject, fear in a player, or even in fiction, like just giving people a sense of what should and shouldn't be, like very quickly, just in like one shot or an establishing sentence even.
No, I think of that like when you're talking about infrastructure. I think of hospitals as the big one for me,
Yep.
where if you've ever had to stay up late with a loved one, and you're going through this like will they won't they die, like and then you have to go home. You have to go to your car, right? It's 3 o'clock in the morning. Visiting hours are over, and you have to follow the painted arrows on the floor, and there's no one in the hospital, and your brain is sort of going like, shouldn't there be a guard or like somebody to help or somebody at the kiosk? And everyone just goes home, and you sort of instinctively know like, well, obviously they've locked the doors that are important, you know, but you have this unrestrained sense of freedom, sort of that you could go anywhere and look at anything. There's a great Lars von Trier miniseries, The Kingdom, which became Kingdom Hospital over here, about a haunted hospital, and it's got the same sort of vibe of just this inhospitable, unrelentingly space that sort of wants to terrify you as the hospital, right? And it goes counter to what you would assume its intentions are, to be this place of healing and hope and hospitality. And you go there and you just feel so much like a cog in a machine, right? And you're wandering these hallways, and you're like, am I going to get out of here? Like, am I ever going to find my car? Right? Like dad can't find his car in the middle of the night after you've left the fair, sort of wandering through parking lots kind of thing. And your brain is saying to protect yourself from the empty space, because the empty space is that unknown and anything could be lurking in there. And the cognitive dissonance of that versus your sort of knowledge that there isn't anything there. Everyone has gone home, but all these rooms are filled with sick, dead, and dying people also, right? And like, where are the workers? Who's here for them, right? It's a very vulnerable thing, empty spaces, both for you and almost for the building, right? Like, we think of cozy spaces as being rooms with a lot of cushions and chairs and really warm. There's a fire, right? And so we don't feel vulnerable in them, right? We feel very safe. But I think the reverse is true, that the empty space feels just as vulnerable to the architecture as it does to the people within it, right? Like, the room is not guarded from humans. It doesn't have things for you to interact with. I've already talked a lot, so I won't dive too much into this sort of stuff. But for me, the big exploration of space that we did in Mothership was Gradient Descent, right? This large abandoned factory that's not abandoned. It's really peopled with lots of remnants and sort of refugees of sort of the past. And some of the things that I think you could sort of directly take home and apply to your games is, we found that bigness in design is communicated in RPGs through detail of objects you can interact with. And what I mean by that is, I think one of the things we did wrong in Gradient Descent is we'd have a big room. If you've read it, you've interacted with this, and it'll be like, this room is huge, miles long. You couldn't possibly ever explore all of it. And there's doors to the west and east. And then there's another giant room, just unfathomably huge. There's no way you could ever figure it all out. And there's doors to the north. And once you hit that sort of over and over and over again, it sort of dulls over your players how big the space is, right? It sort of washes sort of over you, and you can't really wrap your brain around the bigness of the space anymore. And so we realized, contrary to that, bigness is revealed through detail. So if you have a room and it's got, you know, a lamp and a chair and this and that, and it's actually got a closet, and the closet has all this stuff. So players playing the game, the room starts to feel kind of big because there's so much to do, so much to interact with. So like our fix for the future would be big rooms get a spread and they have sub rooms and sub areas and more stuff to interact with. And so that's something like thinking about architecture in your games is if you want the rooms to feel big, even empty rooms, you need to populate them with things. And every now and then you can get away with just like, this room is big, this room's empty, there's nothing in this room, it takes you an hour to get across it. But you can't do that trick too many times in a row. You have to sort of mix it up with rooms that are filled with lots of things. If you've ever played games like Myst or Riven, and most point-and-click adventure games, they have as their sort of central premise that you're going to be given space to interact with these rooms, right? I remember playing Myst as a kid, and my parents got me the strategy guide, and it's like sitting next to me, and this fear that like I know like a velociraptor's not going to jump out of nowhere and start chasing me, but you have this oppression that like something is just waiting to happen to you, right? The space is sort of anticipating things. But it gives you all the time in the world to click around and run back and forth and mess up and get the puzzles wrong. And I think in your dungeon, you can sort of create that with like 3 or 4 rooms that need a lot of interactivity, but are empty. And you just sit back and let the players go back and forth and try things out. And that growing sense that like something is going to click, a door is going to open, a monster is going to come out, we're going to pull the lever, can build this sense of anticipation, which is just very closely related to dread, right? Like dread is negative anticipation, right? And so to create big spaces, you want to have all this interactivity. And then, you know, we've talked about in horror, you're seeing sort of the environmental signs of what's come before, like in creating. So we start right off with like a really strong room of like a body hanging in a lobby, right? And sort of some warning spray paint graffiti like that you shouldn't be here, which is like the common horror trick, right? Like don't go in, dead inside, like the doors are locked. There's all this evidence of people who've come before you and tried to interact with this space, but haven't been able to. And you see that sign that every sort of step you take, you're sort of at a front or transgressing sort of boundaries that you're not meant to transgress. That's another way that space informs us, like locked doors, do not disturb, don't enter, employees only. These are things that the space uses to tell you not to go any further, right? Logo was talking about Chernobyl, like a nuclear reactor is filled with spaces you can and cannot be. And a large part of horror exploration and gaming is going where you're not supposed to go, right? And so setting those markers to your players of like when they're transgressing the space's natural boundaries, I think is really good for horror specifically because it lets them know their level of like intrusion, how far they've intruded, which is like another inhospitable thing, right? Like you don't go into the master bedroom in a house when you're a guest, right? Like that's being a bad guest. And like another way to think of these spaces is that you are guests in them. And the space doesn't want you to go certain places. And as humans, we sort of have that knowledge of like, I'm not supposed to be here, right? But if you pepper that into your design, that you clearly signpost where the players are and are not supposed to be, you can use that sort of social knowledge we have of where we're supposed to be as a tool to get them to feel certain ways about their delve, right? D&D again has like the classic example of this of delving and descending, right? Like every level is further from the sun, every level is further from the surface. You're further underground, further underwater, right? And that's another way that the space tells you you're not supposed to be here. You're in deeper danger, right? And so the last thing I have is just this feeling of unclearable spaces, spaces that you couldn't possibly solve or explore all of, right? That's the mega dungeon, gradient descent, even these like liminal spaces like malls and stuff. So that would be the other tip, is just like having this immense bigness to where you'll never walk off the map. I think gives us this feeling of unease that we can't mark out the boundaries of our territory and know what's inside. We just have to accept we won't be able to go anywhere. Okay, I think this is the perfect time to open it up to questions. So, like I said before, you can walk over to the right side of the stage. Riley Q standing there by the megaphone. If you have a question, you can line up just like in real life if you want, or you can raise your hand if you want to be next, and we'll call on you. So let's take it from there. Anybody have any questions? Anybody have any topics they want to hear more about any of our games or horror, how we approach certain problems? There's a lot in here, I think.
Oh, it's just like a real con.
Yeah, exactly.
There we go.
Here we go.
Charlie.
Somebody's moving.
Let's, oh,
No.
no. Oh,
Here we go.
That's right.
hey!
Oh,
Amanda, hey!
All right, Amanda, what's your question?
Do
you mute?
Yeah.
Double muted. I'm really happy I won that race. I missed some of the first half of this, so I apologize if this has already been asked. But what is sort of your go-to reaction in a game or a setting where people aren't feeling quite as afraid as you hoped they would be? What would be your, your in your toolbox? The first thing you pull out of your toolbox for a situation like that.
At least for me, I don't know if this is what everyone else would do, but for me, I think a big part of it is immediately making isolation either more clear or making it more, or introducing it where it wasn't, because obviously if you're like doing a situation where like, hey, you can call on like the radio or whatever, like, oh, well, you can get things out. But like, if you have a situation where it's just like, hey, shit, the battery's dead on this, town is like 12 hours away, who do we call now that we're in trouble? That's something that I do. I ratchet up the isolation, make them realize that they are alone, or if there are people who could help, they're not going to help.
Yeah, I agree. Like introducing scarcity in some way is always like Logan was saying, is always a nice, just like easy tool to pull out. I also like to, when I structure like my adventures and like running, I like to put characters in situations where in horror their character is forced to make hard and harder decisions. Sometimes even to the point of pushing against what like their established character would have done prior to these problems. And a lot of times that's finding what you think what the characters might be connected with and sort of putting that into danger or making them make those harder decisions. And that's pretty general, but I try to like really push on that and push on the players to see how their characters are changing throughout these events as you're throwing them at them.
I agree. Escalation, scarcity. I use clocks a lot, just because I think they're a fun way to convey tension subtly. Especially when I look down and like they see me like writing something down, or like I don't use screens, so people just kind of get to see all my clocks and stuff. So like when they're taking time or becoming too relaxed or like having a conversation, what the hell, like just being like, all right, well, 15 minutes have passed, and then people start to kind of like get it, like, oh, we're on a timer here. I do a lot of time-based stuff with the nature of the company. Those things are, they're operations. They are things that if they don't complete X, Y, and Z, ABC is going to go wrong. So, those types of things, like creating stakes up front helps to get rid of those situations in the middle of gameplay. Like being upfront with like, this is what's going to happen if you guys don't get your task done. Then we tend to jump over those lulls in the terror and the tension, using systems like Mothership or the burnout system in the company, systems that like they are taking detrimental negative traits on by wasting time, like that helps a lot too. Tailoring it so that like they don't have time to sit around, because then the expediency of having to keep moving takes away from them thinking too much about the situation, and that is good because you don't want them talking about it too much.
And it forces them to make faster decisions, which then you might make the incorrect decision. Oh, did I make the wrong
Bingo.
decision? It's
Right.
like, oh, you can't even worry about that because I threw another one at you.
No, I think that's great. I tend not to worry about whether my players are feeling scared. I like that to be like an opt-in thing, where like usually if somebody wants to be scared, they have to sort of get themselves in the mindset for, right? There's stuff you can do where it's like, okay, let's all calm down, let's stop joking, let's focus on it. But I think a big thing is focusing on, we call them like the omens, because like the monster is not the scary part. Like the monster is the release of the tension, right? So if you're feeling like you're not getting where you want to go, then what you want to do, I think, is sort of introduce more omens, more evidence that things have gone wrong in your space. Discover another dead body, discover a warning. And this is like, you got to use your improvisational skills here. But like, was that something in the rafters? Did you hear like a lullaby in the other room? Like, why is that, cart upended? What's that rusty sound? So focus again more on the signs of like isolation, like Stella said, or on just the omens that like you're not supposed to be here, and delay putting off the reveal for longer if you feel like you haven't gotten there. Great question. Charlie, what do we got?
On a panel yesterday, they talked about how the environment and the setting are characters in themselves, and then also how the NPCs and those characters are the setting in themselves. And so I wondered if anybody had any thoughts about how to make scary characters or NPCs.
Great question.
We were Goblin and I were on a chat last week where Evelyn Moreau talked about making NPCs that sucker the players into trusting them before asking them to do like terrifying things. And that seed has been in my head like for a week, which is just like befriending an NPC that's befriending people and then slowly turns out to be like a terrifying entity, kind of like the people in at the Mouth of Madness by John Carpenter. Like when he gets to the town, like the woman who runs the inn is so nice and so sweet, and then she turns out to be like this tentacle monster. Just tricking your players into trusting your NPCs is a great way to get them abject fright later on.
I have the exact quote from Evelyn, and this is during our conversation during Virtual HorrorCon last weekend. And Evelyn said, at some point it leads, the NPC wants to befriend the characters, and at some point it leads to them befriending you, and now they want you to murder someone. That sort of sense of, instead of NPCs that push away or exploit or are attacking, it's that sort of bringing in closer. And then, like I was saying earlier, when you try to see how has my character changed from the beginning to the end, as the character gets close to the NPC, that relationship then is a trouble point, because it pushes them maybe to do actions that they wouldn't have done prior. The thing I like about horror adventures is that we don't necessarily always have to be, our characters don't have to be heroes. Oftentimes they're forced to make choices where they're not heroic. And some characters do, and some characters don't, and it gives the space for that. And I think that's really fun, and you can use NPCs to do that, or NPCs that have that connection, and then use that connection to sort of push the players. So I don't think it doesn't always have to be hostile or even scary. I think sometimes that slow drip can be of pushing and pushing and pushing.
Even if they have like ideologically different views than the players, on that sense, like that can create tension. And I'm all about tension less than horror, because I think tension tends to feed people's paranoia. And like anytime you can get tension in a game naturally, I'll go for it.
And I think the players tend to inform you, if you're giving space for them to like talk about what's going on or respond to the environment, they'll tell you what they're anticipating, and you can use that. Putting false flags of like people who seem really suspect but they're not, and then the characters, they'll let you know who they think they trust in that sort of chatter, or as they see this room and they're like, what, the bloodstain in this, and they're trying to, as they're talking in and out of character, you can use those seeds to inform the future on. That's why overwriting, I think, can be a problem, and just giving a lot of clues that can be interpreted by your players that you can then use against them.
My bit of advice for this is, honestly, instead of like, at least for me, like instead of going for this larger than life kind of horrific person, make them profoundly normal. I know that sounds weird, but there was one like antagonist I wrote for a mothership thing I did, and the detail I gave about her is that her, like, no matter what, no matter who she's speaking to, she will use honorifics. Also, someone is very much hot micing, whether it's their AC or something.
Might be me.
Yes, it
There we go.
was.
Got it.
Okay.
No worries.
Yeah. It just one of those things where if you put this like spark of like a very mundane humanity, what you end up getting is this kind of make, you know, what it's like, this like middle-aged woman who's just like, well, hello there, ma'am, and then by the end of the conversation she's like, I need you dead, but having in no way like really gone beyond like that kind of very normal like thing. Like that's weird. It is this kind of the idea that the tragedy, that this is someone so used to tragedy and inflicting it upon others that they don't really see this as anything other than normal. That is where a lot of horror can be derived, at least from my experience.
Normal and mundane are the best tools.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think for me, and talking about space a little bit, it's when you find people who have found an unhealthy way to sort of survive in this inhospitable space, right? This comes up a lot in Gradient Descent, and like, I don't recommend just like, making people crazy and role playing what your depiction of mental illness is, but I do think that people can have these coping mechanisms in these extremely inhospitable spaces where they have learned these sort of survival, sort of prison rules, right? That you don't know. And that's scary because it's clear that like the social norms and rules are different here than you're aware of, right? And whether that's that there's like a tea party on level 6 of the dungeon, or whether that's like, we don't speak above a certain level. We always whisper because they're watching, or they're listening. I was actually thinking about Goblin, like you're in the mall and like the security cam or CCTV, like the pervasive sense of being watched is another way that the space is inhospitable to you. But so for NPCs, making it clear that like they've learned a way to survive or thrive or exist within this environment that is at odds with what we would normally find acceptable, and that is unsettling and sort of terrifying. Rogue, we're going to get to you in a second. We had a question in the chat that I want to scroll up to. Jeff said, what is a space that you would really like to explore in a future sign, even if it's been done already? Goblin, you want to start with that?
Yeah. So I love to watch films and then use those to inspire what I write next. It's a tool I really like, and I just watched Haunted School, which is called something else in Japan, but I think just there's something about everyone's gone to school before, and not necessarily with people there abandoned school. I think is a fun setting because we all have our own connotations with them. And they often sit abandoned for quite a while. Not that abandons are the only places I like. I think coastal horror in general is a thing that I want to like really spend time in, like spaces around the coast and how they interconnect. There's something about Messiah of Evil, and just
Woof.
things tend to go wrong near the water.
That reminds me, I got to send you those Dune pics from Michigan.
Yes.
We did a cruise ship in the company conflict resolution guidelines, but I am itching to get back to a cruise ship. I think cruise ships are like terrifying. I think they're malls on the water. And there's this idea. Carnival was doing like a 9-month cruise around the world for like rich people, and that sounds like a Ballard novel to me. And like I really just want to explore. I do international logistics and shipping for my job, and like boats are massive now, and they're terrifying. Like I just I'm obsessed with that stuff.
I'm really interested in. I was reading this book Underland by Robert McFarlane that just talks about giant nuclear waste disposal sites and caves and all this sort of like underground infrastructure. If y'all haven't read it, Logan in particular, I think you'd be really fascinated by this book. But it just impressed on me like how terrifying caves are as this like deep memory of the world in this like long period of time. I went into the catacombs in Paris a few years ago, and that started me down this like rabbit hole of like underground is scary, and that is the thing that we take the most granted for in D&D. Is you're like, we're just underground, the sun can't reach us, that's no problem, I've got a torch that will last 2 hours. When in reality it's like cave-ins and places where like there's a book by Tor Heyerdahl about, it's called Aku Aku, but it's about exploring, I think, Easter Island. And there's like passages like, oh, we had to crawl on our bellies for a mile. And there was this feeling that like if the guy behind you died or the guy in front of you died, you wouldn't actually have room to turn around and crawl back the way you came. Caves are notoriously hard to map, which makes them very difficult to game. Veins of the Earth deals with this a little bit, a lot. So caves are something I really want to go to and sort of put my stamp on. Like, how do you do an adventure that really impresses upon people the reality of how terrifying caves are in real life? And in terms of inhospitability, like how much like the Earth does not care if you die while inside it or on top of it or whatever. Stella, what about you? Any space that you've been wanting to explore that you haven't gotten to yet?
Indianapolis.
Sure. You never been to Gen Con?
No, I have not. But no, it's actually, I was talking about this with some folks last night. It is the basis of a mothership adventure I'm writing, which I'm going to bully you, Sean McCoy, into making it the first party mothership thing that takes place at a furry convention.
I could see that. Yeah.
Part of it is the fact that it is a space that is overwhelmingly dominated by conventions and like strangers coming in and coming out, and having these places just dedicated for a whole bunch of people to come. And that's just weird to me. As I've said before, I'm sort of an agoraphobic shut-in. So like just having a place dedicated to like, yeah, here's a bunch of strangers now. That's just not my vibe. So it's really creepy to me. So Indianapolis is a big inspiration. I know it sounds silly, like all of you talking about our stuff, but I'm like, no, it's Indianapolis. That's a godforsaken city,
You're correct.
Yeah, it's not Demon Fuck Cleveland, but it's definitely not much better.
It's a weird city in that it's like very much built for conventions. I think Gen Con, 30 years ago, in 2018 or whatever, when I went, there was like a Taylor Swift concert and an NFL game and Gen Con all going on at the same time. And the city's like built for it, right? And there's all these people of groups that don't intermingle, like forced into a situation with each other. So I get it for sure.
Forcing two groups of people together in those kind of settings is really perfect. Stella, I have a story for you about furries and a teacher convention happening at the same place that we'll do in Discord, because I think it'll feed right into that for you.
I went to a international board game championship that was also the American archery championships. So it was a very weird day. Let's get Rogue off the
just for everyone, we hit 1 hour, but since this is no longer streamed, it's going to be put up afterwards. We have extra buffer time, so we don't have that end time crunch.
Sick.
I believe the plan was an hour to 90 minutes. So yeah.
Awesome.
All right, Rogue, we've got you unmuted. Go for it.
I know y'all mentioned a couple of examples like The Shining and House of Leaves. Is there any other media you can think of that does liminal horror well?
Oh,
I actually have a lot to say because when preparing for this panel, I decided what I was going to do was try and find people talk about liminal horror, see what's being said. And I came to the conclusion that 90% of the people talk about liminal horror on the internet are dullards who know nothing. Because
What's your conclusion?
because overwhelmingly a lot of the stuff is just like, wouldn't it be fucked up if you were like alone in the dark?
sure.
And it's just like, yeah, man, that would be fucked up. But two bits of like really good. Well, there's three, at least in my mind, really big liminal horror things. There's one, the thing that kind of popularized it amongst the dullards, which was that May 2000, no, May 12th, 2019 4chan post about the back rooms, which was basically the idea of this infinite like office building that you can get into by accident, like by phasing out of reality. That's like the famous one is Spawn It All. But two things that predated I think are really good is one, SCP-3008 posted May 4th, 2017, which is the Infinite IKEA, which is basically you get trapped in an infinite IKEA and there's weird employee-like things that try and kill you. It's pretty good. And then 2014's Naissance, which is focused on exploring this megastructure that is nominally built for humans, kind of, and you're just alone there. I think those are two really good bits of liminal horror that you can check out and enjoy.
Can you spell naissance for us?
Oh god, it's a French word with an e at the end. Well, with an extra e at the end. Let
Nico,
me.
put it in the chat.
It's like Renaissance, but without the re, and then an extra e at the end. Yeah, but there's like an extra e at the end. I'm horrible at spelling.
No problem.
Yeah. Wait, is there two s's in ASOP? I don't fuck it. Oh, okay. So I googled it. It's apparently this. This is how you spell it. I do not understand the French language. Its ways confuse and beguile me.
If we're talking, so not necessarily explicitly liminal spaces in media, but thinking about just like horror and architecture. I know that I wrote a game called Liminal Horror, but in the end, it's more focused on like setting and architecture and like different genres of horror. I think ones that really resonate with me that I used as touchstones and like the mall and a couple other things, like The Thing, right? Being in an Antarctic station, being trapped there, the sort of layout, that setting is explicitly leads to the tension of the whole story and the whole core concept of can we navigate and survive within it without letting it get out. The Void by Astron 6, which is set in a hospital.
That was gonna be mine.
Logan, you took my no, yeah. So I think those two really do well, but also explicitly, both have people trapped there, and not that that's the only way, but I do think that is a thing I think is really fun, especially in a TTRPG setting. Evil Dead 2, talk about a small space that you can't really get out of, right? The bridge is up.
That's that cabin. Like the cabin is like horror is architecture. The haunted house, the cabin in the woods. These are all spaces, right? I think that's huge. Yeah.
Like summer camp. We're at funeral camp right now, but like the second I hear summer camp, I think of masks and axes and machetes.
I'm gonna go a little off beat here. The Metal Gear Solid 1 and 2. Metal Gear Solid 1 and 2 are just about being in a place of architecture, Shadow Moses and the Big Shell, and dealing with the horrors of military warfare, as well as all of those characters have different manifestations of PTSD, different like some of them are megalomaniacs. When Fat Man loses his mind, it just becomes a mad bomber archetype towards the middle of Metal Gear Solid 2. Metal Gear Solid 3 is my favorite one though. It's the best one. But like those, I love Kojima's games. I think Hideo Kojima has a grasp of horror and the American military industrial complex that a lot of people just don't like touch on, and he gets into my head. And a lot of the stuff I write is around this infrastructure, but the infrastructure of Shadow Moses especially is like burned into. I know that facility better than like my apartment, I think. Just like I can go in this duct, or I can go behind the Hind D, or like Metal Gear. Like I love those games, and I know they're not considered horror games, but there are some truly horrific set pieces in there. The Psycho Mantis fight. I mean, just Vulcan Raven alone is a terrifying idea. A man who's essentially a tank. Like I love those games. I think that they convey a sense of urgency and horror in a way that a lot of people don't think about it. And it was my first approach to nonlinear gameplay. Like you can go about solving those situations however you want. You'll probably die, but the illusion of choice is there. So I would say, yeah, the Metal Gear Solid games and Death Stranding, like Kojima does a great job, like deconstructing his own games in that. I think by making it open world, which
it's only hitting me like with you saying MGS, which like is like my favorite game. That like this is a game about war that does not take place on a battlefield. It takes place in the industrial complex part of it, at the research centers, right? So like that's where this war game is taking place, and it just goes to show you like in a very subtle way that I've never thought about for like 20 years until now, that like Kojima's saying the real horror, the real war is like back at the office,
right,
where like these decisions are being made to kill millions of people. It's not anywhere near where the fighting's happening, right?
Well, it's like the people who designed this hostile architecture in San Francisco, the people who designed these
Right.
benches that you're not supposed to, like, that's horror. Like those people actively did that.
They're
And,
in
like,
an office space.
And yeah, and like that's where like the real mind-breaking horror of reality is coming into play, is people doing these things, like creating these things, and then going on and living their lives.
There's a book, I'm not remembering the title right now, I'm going to butcher it, but it's something about like the mundanity of horror, whatever, but it's basically about the Holocaust and how like the horror of the Holocaust is taking place in office rooms and people looking at numbers and making these decisions to treat human beings like numbers. And that's a big, big thing. For me, the list, it's long because I have a dungeon fiction iOS note. I'm just obsessed with mega dungeons, and I'm always trying to find good mega dungeon fiction, which like is a genre that doesn't really exist. But like the Myst games for sure. Blame the manga, huge exploration of internal space. Piranesi by Susanna Clarke, who did Jonathan Strange and Mr. Norrell, the person in this strange labyrinth, amazing book. Underland by McFarlane, which is just like this exploration of things in the ground, which I love. Borges' Labyrinths, The Strange Library by Murakami, is a good one. Logan, have you read A Pattern Library?
I haven't.
Okay, so this is a book about like utopic design, and like it basically lays out. It's a mind breaking book for RPG designers, because it basically lays out these patterns on the small level, like build a bed, to the big level, like green spaces should exist between working and home spaces or whatever. And it was this idea to create sort of this utopic guidebook on how you could very quickly, not quickly, but how you could build these spaces that were very welcoming to humans in a lot of ways on the micro and macro level. Beautiful, beautiful book. Very easy to read. Legends of Grimrock. I played it on iOS. It's a dungeon crawler, but like it really got into my brain, the like classic dungeon crawler of just like walking through a stone place, only hearing your armor, only seeing the torch go down, a skeleton pops out. Is this horrific architecture. Very, very, very well done. Amnesia Dark Descent, Abandoned Manor, The Kingdom by Lars von Trier, this short, miniseries about a haunted hospital, which became Stephen King's Kingdom Hospital in the U.S., I think. But The Kingdom's really good. This is like kind of a weird deep cut. It's called Zero Abyssal Somewhere. And it is a game on itch that if you Google it, you'll just see this really strange, empty space that you kind of explore by yourself, big grinding gears under bridges. It's exactly my shit when we're talking about this. If any of y'all heard of Petscop, this is like a YouTube sort of series, and it's done like a stream of a video game called Petscop, where the person's exploring it, and then further they find like a hidden area in the game that they hadn't found, which opens up into a massive hidden area of this like kid pet game, and the game starts to feel haunted itself, like you're in a haunted PlayStation game. There's like tons of fan theories about what's going on, long running series, but just a great twist on like, a hidden menu and a could you try again? Shut up, Siri. On a hidden menu on a PlayStation disc can be as much like a liminal horror architecture space as like a dungeon. Like there's new ways to look at old spaces that we take for granted. My House Walkthrough on YouTube, classic horror short of this person doing laps in their space, kind of like PT by Kojima. Yes, Kitty Horror Show, Anatomy. I'm seeing that in the chat. Big one. Another exploration of a house, and the house's anatomy, where you're just going and clicking on audio cassette rooms in different rooms. Kitty Horror Show is huge inspiration. Brian Evenson, the books of Brian Evenson, specifically the short story collection of Collapse of Horses, big inspiration on Mothership. But check out the sci-fi horror short, The Dust, that he wrote, which is about this dust in a mining ship or facility that's like slowly detaching the workers from reality. And then Castlevania Symphony of the Night, this giant space that's not built for anyone, and why are there like hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of fish monsters in there? Like the place is more bustling than like a downtown square, but also feels very terrifying in a way that's kind of loud and bright, and not empty and dark. Yeah, that's my long list of just like spaces that creep me out.
Evanson's so good. I highly recommend if you're interested in horror fiction at all to check out the works of Brian Evanson. Collapse of Horses, Song for the Unraveling of the World. Oh man. Also like John Langan, The Fisherman.
Yeah, I've been wanting to get into him.
Wide Carnivorous Sky is probably one of the best horror short stories I've ever read. Laird Barron does a lot of really great stuff with space in the Pacific Northwest in horror. I think the world we live in is very terrifying, but it's interesting to watch a new generation of horror writers really kind of explore it in a way that hasn't been done before. And there's a really big renaissance in horror fiction right now that I highly recommend checking out if you have even a passing interest in horror.
Yeah, the short fiction, I guess, especially, is definitely really like Filthy Loot Publishing, weird punk books.
Word Horde is doing a lot of really great stuff.
There's this Evanson story. I can't remember if it's called The Game or if that's just what I remember, but it's about these kids who basically they have this game where they take turns hurting each other.
Yeah.
But they have to like. What's that?
Oh, I had a game like that in grade school called Pain, which was kind of like Helicopter, but the purpose was to inflict as much pain as possible by swinging the jump rope really fast.
Oh, God,
I had like nasty bruise. I was a weird kid.
But this is the kind of thing kids do, and basically they have to like hurt each other. I can't remember if it's like you have to hurt yourself and the other person has to hurt themselves worse, or if it's you just hurt each other more and more and more. And it has this like, I'm just going to ruin the ending for you, where it's like they haven't seen each other in like 20 years. And like somebody shows up at the other one's doorstep and it all comes rattling back because it continues escalating. You don't start over from your last part, and just like what that person does, I think, to themselves. But like Evanson's just really great on zeroing in these micro fictions of just extreme discomfort.
Ligotti as well. Like Thomas
Ligotti, yeah,
is the OG on this. Like he will worm his way into your psyche with like a comfort with the prose, and then just flip a switch. And that guy's a master. Only living author to have a Penguin Classic collection.
of only living author.
Yeah.
Oh wow, yeah, because he's got that. I forget what it's called.
Yeah, the Grimscribe.
Grimscribe, yeah.
Yeah, they collected his two. Penguin collected his 2 short story collections.
But yeah, huge renaissance going on. And my introduction was through Ligotti to Evanson to Barron, and then I want to read this Fisherman one, which everyone's talking about.
Sean, it's probably one of my favorite horror novels of all time. It's
and
like
I've heard
3 books in one, and oh boy.
I've been worried because people say like, oh, it's slow. And I have a very short attention span, but I don't. Sometimes things are slow and they just keep moving and keep pushing on you, and then it's like it doesn't matter because you're always engaged.
Langen's got just the way he'll keep you engaged. Like the writing is top
notch. If that is it, I'm scrolling up. I don't think I've seen any other.
I saw a question, but I think it got lost.
Five Nights at Freddy's themed RPG.
So as they're looking for that, another thing worth watching is if anyone's seen The Black Tower. It's a short film in London about a man and the Black Tower follows him. It's, oh my gosh, it's so good. 22 minutes long. I'll drop it in the chat. And he's just narrating this tower that follows from every angle and no one else can see it. Talk about architecture literally being the thing that is terrorizing him.
We have one from Amanda Mullins in the chat. Some examples of favorite uses of the mundane is terrifying in RPGs. That's a good question.
In RPGs specifically,
I think something. I know that Curse of Strahd, that first edition, was problematic in a lot of ways. The toy maker that is in that adventure, you see these toys that have these tags on them in all the towns as you work your way through that module, and they become more and more fucked up like as you find them, and then you finally meet the toy maker, and he's like he's just very happy, which is really unsettling, especially in the Barovia setting, and that always struck me as like a really interesting juxtaposition with the set. And I played him as this very jovial toy maker who's just like, I'm the only person bringing joy to anyone here.
That's great.
And it's really, and then you find out later that he made a Clockwork Man for Strahd that's terrorizing Castle Ravenloft, and it's like, okay, what the hell's going on? But I really liked the idea of these toys, and the kids would have these toys that would be passed down from generation to generation because they can't die. Nobody in Barovia can die. They just their souls just inhabit whoever's born. So they're the same. They're playing the same cycle over and over again. I really think they did a good job with it. That new version is a lot better because it has a lot less overt racism in it, which is nice.
Sure.
But some of that stuff they did in there was pretty interesting and worth checking out.
Yeah, that's huge. Of course, the Mall, Liminal Horror, and the Company are great examples of the mundane in horror. It's gauche to pimp your own work, but I think a lot of us are in this space because we're designing the stuff we wanna see, right? You could make an argument for Earthbound to the Mother games, right, being that intersection of horror and the mundane, both in that classic it's the 90s and we're kids, right, but also the sort of surreality or unreality of the place. And if you meet it halfway and sort of take it as this Nintendo game is just off, right? You'll really get a lot out of those games, I think.
I think Electric Bastionland does it well, in the sense of it takes the mundane and then stretches it into a way that it becomes so surreal and horrifying. And Bastion itself and just the bureaucracies of that, I think, do really allow you to play into that really well. What's normal seems so out of place, and then it makes you it's unsettling.
Yeah, I actually don't have a lot of RPG touch points for like mundane horror, because most of the time I'll just like look at the news and see stuff like, oh yeah, this court ruled that just because this guy is innocent doesn't mean he should be taken off the death panel, off of death row. It's just like, hey, what? Like we're just like, oh yeah, innocence is not enough proof to get you off of death. Stuff like that. It's literally just reading the news where I get most of my like, well, I guess this new unbearable horror is normal now. It's on
This
ABC.
like Kafka thing, right? Where it's just like it doesn't matter, right?
Yeah.
Like looking at the James Webb pictures last week, I was like, and I'm supposed to keep thinking money is the most important thing in my life right now. Like, I just witnessed the breadth of existence in a single image, and now I'm supposed to like give a shit about my paycheck. Come on,
Right.
Like,
Yeah, that kind of perspective is because you think of that as like cosmic horror, right? Like this idea that we're infinitesimally small. But like I'm a hopeful person at heart, and so there's also this cosmic optimism of like we're infinitesimally small. Like the sword cuts both ways.
I mean,
you
how
know?
lucky are we to be living at this point
Yeah.
in just the existence of humanity to be able to witness like this expanse of the universe?
Yeah.
I mean, the universe may be indifferent to our existence, but I'm not indifferent to its.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, that's a great sentiment. Absolutely.
There's a song I really like called Your Heart's a Big Tent by Willie Carlisle, and it opens and closes with this line. This morning a miracle happened as promised, the rise of the world's closest star. And that's, I think, a really good way to like view things, in the fact that like it is undoubtedly the small things that make uh, life worth living. I know this is unrelated to horror, I guess. It's just something that was on my mind because we were talking about.
No, keep going.
Yeah, I mean, for me, like, and this like sounds silly, but like the reason why I get up and keep going is so I can have a good meal with friends later in the day, Like
Yeah.
that's, as far as I'm concerned, that's all there is to live for, and that's wonderful, Like just keeping it small, I think, is a great way to view the world, or else you will give in to the realization that everything we've ever fought for is just a pale blue dot, and not realize the beauty of that.
I can't think of a better place to leave it than that. This pale blue dot is a form of architecture.
The ultimate
Thank
architecture.
you, Logan, Stella, Goblin, for being guests. This was a great panel, one of my favorites I've ever been on. I would talk about this stuff all the time. Anytime y'all want to throw down about horror and architecture and gaming, I'm down for that. Thank y'all for being a great audience. I don't know how you do this like shoot confetti thing.
Press F.
All right, but yeah, but
F in the chat.
overwhelmingly an improvement on real cons is this ability to throw confetti everywhere.
Yeah.
Oh, it'd be such a
Thanks so much,
nightmare to
guys.
clean up.
In 2025, when I go to Gen Con, I'll just bring like a panel with, or like little backpack full of confetti and like a reversed leaf blower or whatever, and just, I'm sure they won't escort me out of the con for,
Not if you do it in Indianapolis.
That's true.
They have the
Indianapolis has no rules.
They have the built-in
Only violence.
infrastructure for it.
Exactly.
The contingency plan,
This was great. Do we want to do a quick round of plugs?
Yeah, please. Yeah. If you're listening, yeah. Let's just start. Goblin, let's start with you.
Yeah, I'm Goblin Archives. You can find me on Twitter at goblin_archives. I write stuff for Liminal Horror, and I'm a big fan of following Sean's advice about building community around your own game, and so I'm always down to help support anyone who is making stuff for Liminal Horror. If you have questions, just shoot me a DM. I try to be pretty responsive.
Stella.
Hello, I'm Stella. You can see me here on this, as my display name, 500 pounds of nothing. Wait, I should probably 500 pounds of nothing. I don't know if it's reversed or not, so who knows. But you can find me at itch at 500 pounds of nothing, one word, no spaces, or on Twitter at pounds of nothing, I run Rimbound Transmissions, which is a monthly mothership pamphlet delivered to your doorstep for $4 a month.
It's great.
It
It's
is really good. I would say there's definitely 7 of them, and they're all pretty good.
I am Logan. I am at L__Dean. That's a long L. You can find my stuff at mega-corp.itch.io. I wrote the company. There's an expansion called the Conflict Resolution Guidelines, which has 6 adventures and a new class. I wrote an adventure called Extraction from Demon Fucked Cleveland, which is up for 2 Annie Awards right now, which is really weird and surprising. But if you wanted to vote for it, I wouldn't be mad at you. And there's some other games up there. All my stuff's free. Please feel free to take a look. And if you wanted to rate it 5 stars, I would love you forever.
I'm Sean McCoy. You can find me at on Twitter at Sean McCoy, or you can go to Tuesday Night Games at playtkg.com. We're just working on the Mothership box set right now, and I'm deep in the weeds. We had a little girl in December, so this is like the first time I've talked to people in like half a year, so this has been great. All right, well that's everything. If that's nothing else, I think we step away from the podiums, and this is done.
And then I'm gonna get some coffee and probably hang out.
Yeah,
See if anybody wants to chat.
Sweet.
I'm just gonna be chilling in the main place. See y'all later.
Bye. Thanks
Oh,
again,
bye.
all. Thanks for playing.
Bye. Have fun. Be afraid.